Puyi, or Puyi in Mandarin, was born on February 7, 1906. He was also known as Henry Puyi and was designated Emperor Xuan Tong. He was the last emperor of China of the Qing dynasty from 1908 until his forced abdication in 1912 due to the Xinhai Revolution. He was also emperor of the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo from 1934 until the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1945 under the name Kang De. From the age of 2, he ruled the Chinese Empire. However, with the revolution, he lost his empire, was used as a puppet, and ended his life in a humble way. Aisin Jioro Puyi was born in Beijing in February 1906 when his uncle, Guangxu, was emperor of China. But the latter lived under house arrest for 8 years, imposed by his aunt, the Empress Dowager Cixi, who had already chosen the young man to occupy the dragon throne, remaining as regent under the title of Holy Mother, Empress Dowager. On November 13, 1908, she moved the official residence of the emperors and their court as well as the ceremonial and political center of the Chinese government to the Forbidden City. The one chosen as successor to the dying ruler Guangxu was Puyi. Despite his young age, he never forgot his encounter with the formidable Cixi, whose haggard and terrifying face he saw through a gray curtain. They say I started screaming loudly and shaking uncontrollably when I saw her. Cixi had someone give me sweets, but I threw them on the floor and shouted, "I want my nanny! I want my nanny!" to her great dismay, he would recall years later. At only 16, Cixi, whose father worked in the government, was elected to concubine to Emperor Xianfeng, who was 4 years older than her. Although she was classified as a low-ranking concubine, her luck changed when she became the emperor's only mistress to give birth to a man. As she became the mother of the future heir to the throne, she became a favorite of Xianfeng, who listened to her advice. The emperor was weak and was very fond of Cixi, so he allowed her to participate in political decisions. Xuanfeng died in 1861, aged only 30. His successor, Tongzhi, Cixi's son, was only 5 years old. Through various maneuvers, Cixi managed to become her son's regent, but deep down she was in charge. When Tongzhi came of age in 1873, his mother officially left power. However, he died 2 years later. Since Tongzhi had not chosen an heir, Cixi did it for him. He chose her nephew Guangxu, son of her sister and Xianfeng's brother, and adopted him. Guangxu was only 3 years old, and once again, Cixi and Qian became regents. The empress, even in her regency, made several political and economic reforms, confronting foreign powers and the cultural modernization emerging in China. Later, she clashed with her nephew, Guangxu, and imprisoned him. Cixi died without having prepared anyone to succeed her, choosing again by naming as her heir a child, her 2-year-old great-nephew, Puyi. Puyi became the 12th emperor of the Qing dynasty and the youngest in China's long imperial history. Puyi was a descendant of the Manchu tribes, who defeated the Ming and founded the Qing dynasty in 1644. During this period, China doubled in size to include the Xinjiang region in the far west, as well as Mongolia and Tibet, creating the profile that China has to this day. The new dynasty tolerated various peoples and religions, and created great cultural enterprises. In the 18th century, China was arguably the world's largest economy, with a rich culture and prosperity. Its emperors lived in the heart of its opulent capital, Beijing, surrounded by imperial guards and Manchurian noble families. But by the 19th century, the Qing dynasty began to weaken, unable to defend China from military conflicts with British, American, French, German, and Japanese forces. In 1850, a Chinese Christian convert, Hong Xiuquan, proclaimed himself leader of a new dynasty, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. With his followers, he marched against the Qing, increasing his support base as he went. The subsequent civil war lasted 14 years. Some 20 million people lost their lives in a conflict that ultimately involved European and Chinese soldiers. The Taiping Rebellion was one of the most important events in China in the 19th century and made its mark as the Boxer Uprising, a rebellion by villagers in their northern provinces who were desperate and hungry, blaming foreigners for their plight and expelling merchants and missionaries. The movement began in 1898, besieged Beijing in the summer 1900, but was eventually brutalized in September 1901. This was the China that little Puyi would rule. In other times, the weakness of the Qing dynasty would have led to the rise of another. But the 10th century increased its possibilities. While Puyi was trained to fulfill his role as ruler, surrounded by privileges that even included owning other people, such as the eunuchs who took care of him and had to obey his every whim, a revolution was brewing against the power of his dynasty. For many Chinese, these rulers had lost their heaven-given mandate. In 1911, the Xinhai Revolution broke out. On February 12, 1912, Empress Dowager Longyu sealed the imperial edict of abdication of the emperor. The widowed empress was sitting in a room at the side of the palace, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief, while a fat old man, Prime Minister Yuan Shikai, knelt before her on a red cushion, tears rolling down his face. He was sitting to the window's right and wondered why the two adults were crying. Puyi says in his memoirs, "They wept as he formally ended his rule and the 267 years of power of the Qing dynasty." But he, at 6 years old, was obvious to those realities. And so it continued. As the revolution progressed, everyone was in uncharted territory. With the end of the imperial system after 2,000 years, no one knew exactly what to do with the deposed imperial house. Send them to Manchuria or lead them in Beijing. In the end, they decided to treat him as they did foreign kings, allowing him to live in the Forbidden City, enjoying the luxury of his imperial palace and gardens. So little changed for Puyi. For a time, he was not even informed that he was no longer emperor and continued to enjoy the privileges that are hard to imagine today. When China became a republic and humanity advanced into the 20th century, I was still living as an emperor, breathing the dust of the 19th century, he wrote. In 1917, he was even renamed as emperor by the pro-monarchist general Zhang Xun, who struck a coup and took over as regent of the empire. But that lasted only 2 weeks. Puyi and his court were not held responsible for what happened. Puyi grew up in this strange environment, isolated from the outside world, separated from his family, with no other reference except his nanny, Wang. But he continued to be treated as a deity, whom no one could disturb. Even when he behaved, according to his own later account, in a nefarious manner. Whipping the eunuchs was part of my daily routine. My cruelty and love of power were already too strong for persuasion to have any effect. But in 1919, Reginald Johnston, a British scholar who entered the Qing court to be Puyi's tutor, described him to British authorities, a very humane boy, with vigor, intelligence, and a sense of humor. In addition, he has excellent manners and is totally free from arrogance. In this way, Puyi became a teenager, whose acts of defiance included walking outside the Forbidden City, wearing spectacles, and cutting his traditional Manchu braid. But he still had to obey traditions, for example, the emperor's great nuptials. I married 4 wives, or, resorting to the terms used at the time, an empress, a secondary consort, and 2 minor consorts. But they were not royal wives, and they were only as ornamental elements, Puyi wrote. Outside, the country was still searching for answers to the convolutions of the end of the imperial system. In 1924, Puyi's perks ended. The warlord Feng Yuxiang came to power and expelled Puyi and his entourage from the Forbidden City. At age 19, Puyi took refuge with the Japanese. When they invaded Manchuria in 1931, they proclaimed him Emperor of Manchukuo, a puppet state created from the 3 historic provinces of Manchuria located in northeastern China. At the time, Japanese propaganda described the birth of Manchukuo as a pan-Asian triumph, bringing together the 5 races of Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, Manchus, and Mongols, and race is used according to the meaning assigned by the Japanese at the time. According to them, this would mark the birth of a new civilization and a turning point in world history. Like the state, Puyi was also a puppet, as Manchukuo was tightly controlled by Tokyo, which used this region as an expansionist base in Asia. His life turned into a nightmare. Obsessed by the fact that most of his subjects detested him, as Manchukuo was one of the most brutally governed countries in the world, he lived like a virtual prisoner in the palace. He did little more than sign decrees approved by the Japanese. His cruel streak was exacerbated, and he tormented his servants, not only with the usual whippings, but by also cutting off the amount of food. In addition, he became a Buddhist, a mystic, and a vegetarian. During the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, he remained steadfast with his masters. As he himself admitted, he made so many pro-Japanese statements that no ally would accept them if he fled Manchukuo. But he was forced to do so on August 11, 1945, when he finally realized that Japan was not winning the war. He left by train with his court and the treasures of the Qing dynasty. On August 16th, he abdicated as Emperor of Manchukuo and declared once again in his last decree that he was part of China, a day after Japan's surrender. Puyi was eventually arrested by the Soviet Red Army while trying to fly to Japan. The Soviets, who initially didn't recognize him, took him to the city of Chita in Siberia. He was imprisoned but entitled to more comforts and privileges than other inmates, something that made him feel grateful to the ruler Joseph Stalin. There, like everyone else, he received a communist formation. Meanwhile, China was still hungry for ideas and could have gone in many different directions. After decades of warlords, a Japanese invasion, and a civil war, the Communist Party, with its close ties to the Stalinist Soviet Union, managed to prevail. Mao Zedong proclaimed the new republic in 1949 at the Heavenly Peace Square, the home of the emperors. It was the place where processions took place whenever the emperor left his throne to perform rituals to please the gods. There, the communists decided to hang portraits of their heroes. After nearly 40 years of war and instability, China had found peace. And for Puyi, one of the emperors whose job it was to maintain diplomatic relations between humans and the celestial world, the time had come to return home, even if he didn't want to. He feared the fate that awaited him in communist China, but Mao Zedong simply sent him to a re-education camp. He spent 10 years there, where for the first time he had to do things like brush his teeth and dress himself, as well as work and learn about communism. In 1960, Mao granted China's last emperor a special gift: citizenship and freedom. But what could Puyi do after that, now that he was a citizen and not a divine being? Well, the man who had ruled the world's most populous country went on to work as a gardening assistant in the Beijing Botanical Garden and as an editor in the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference after 1964. And he was also the author of an autobiography entitled From Emperor to Citizen, endorsed by Mao's senior party officials. Puyi fully learned the lessons of free socialist education, considering the statements in his book and those he uttered at various events. Like at his 5th and last wedding to Li Shuxian, a hospital nurse, in 1962, when he proclaimed, "Let us remember this day and continue to learn from the working class in all our future days together. I hate the first half of my life because it was a humiliating experience to be an exploiter and parasite." Puyi died in Beijing of problems arising from kidney cancer and heart disease on October 17, 1967, at the age of 61.